what we have here.
Felony hazing charges.
It's chilling surveillance video of college freshmen pledging a fraternity.
Did all of that for something that doesn't matter.
So where do we go from here? Hi guys, it's Julesy, and we're back for another YouTube video. This time, we're going to be talking about hazing. Now, most of this conversation is going to be centered from the Divine Nine perspective, as I am a member of a D9 organization. But this conversation overall is not just specific to the D9, and really a lot of the premise that I'm going to discuss in this video will be more so about why this is not specific to D9 organizations, nor is the issue of hazing specific just to fraternities, sororities, and college organizations. The conversation around hazing is not a simple conversation. It is quite complex. And currently, it's come back to top of mind for me because of the death of one young Caleb Wilson at Southern University in March of 2025, so earlier this year, who died while participating in a ritual that existed outside of the official membership intake process for the Omega Psi Phi chapter at Southern University. And Caleb Wilson's case resonated so deeply because it was a clear-cut example of the violence in pledging that directly led to a death. And no matter the frequency or infrequency that one might argue these deaths actually occur, nobody is sending their child anywhere, but especially not to a college, to have their child die while pursuing membership into any organization. Now, while I'm having this conversation from the D9 lens as a member of a Divine Nine organization myself, this is not at all an issue that is specific to the Divine Nine. It's not even specific to fraternities or sororities or college organizations at large. But I am going to have the conversation from that framework because that is the framework that I know best. And honestly, would anybody watch this video if I titled it, America Has a Hazing Problem? Because it does. Now, before we dive too deeply in here, allow me to give you some definitions so everyone can join in and follow along on this video. And if you're new here, be sure to subscribe. You're in for a lot of fun and deep, thoughtful, well-curated, critical discourse on my YouTube channel. And for everyone and for all, be sure to comment down below. I definitely want to hear your thoughts. Comment along as you watch the video and share. It definitely helps. What is D9? You'll hear me reference that a lot. Now, D9 or Divine Nine are the colloquial terms for the 9 organizations that make up the National Pan-Hellenic Council, also known as NPHC. A lot of acronyms happen in this space here. It's comprised of 5 fraternities and 4 sororities, most which were founded at the turn of the 20th century at one Howard University. And don't worry, we're gonna go through each of these 9 organizations so you know who's who. We have Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, which was founded in 1906 at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. Then there's Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority in 1908, founded at Howard University. Kappa Alpha Psi, founded in 1911 at Indiana University in Bloomington. Followed by Omega Psi Phi, also founded in 1911 at Howard University. Delta Sigma Theta sorority, well, I have to say the Incorporated, founded in 1913 at Howard University. Then we have Phi Beta Sigma fraternity, founded in 1914 at Howard University. Zeta Phi Beta sorority, founded in 1920, and I probably should have been wearing my Zora Neale Hurston shirt, but for all you Zetas, and for any book lover, really, go pick up the Zora Neale Hurston shirt. Shout out to one of your earliest members, but Zeta Phi Beta was founded in 1920 at Howard University. Sigma Gamma Rho, founded in 1922 at Butler University in Indiana. And rounding out the Divine Nine is Iota Phi Theta, founded in 1963 at Morgan State University. Do you really need to hold on to that history? No, but in case you wanted to know, I'm probably going to refer to these organizations by their acronyms or their colloquial names, you could keep up with me. Now let's define some of the common terms that are used in this realm. Pledging. Within this subset, pledging specifically, not always, but within this particular conversation, refers to the membership initiation process that occurs outside of an organization's official guidelines and policy for membership intake. Now, intake is the process in which people's apply, interview, are then selected and go through an official intake process that is ordained by the national executive body of said organization. Crossed means to have completed intake and be officially accepted into the organization. Now, we absolutely have to define hazing, and we are going to use the legal definition for hazing. And the HR 5646, the Stop Campus Hazing Act, defines hazing to mean any intentional, knowing, or reckless act committed by a person, whether individually or in concert with other persons, against another person or persons, regardless of the willingness of such other person or persons to participate, that one is committed to the course of an initiation into, an affiliation with, or the maintenance of membership in a student organization, club, athletic team, fraternity, or sorority. And two, causes or creates a risk above the reasonable risk encountered in the course of participation in the institution of higher education or the organization of physical or psychological injury. Within that definition, I want you to hold on to this very important piece. It causes or creates risk above the reasonable risk encountered. Because what is reasonable risk? This policy definition leaves open a legal argument for what can be considered reasonable and at what point does something become hazing. Again, we are here, and I thought to do this video because of the death of Caleb Wilson at Southern University, who was participating in an initiation ritual that was outside of the official intake process. He was pledging the Omega Psi Phi chapter at Southern University, and the ritual had his big brothers, men who were already members, who had already come through the chapter. And it turns out these men weren't even just members who had already crossed into the chapter and were still matriculating at Southern University. These were largely men who had already graduated from Southern University and had come back, were using the warehouse of one's father, who was also a member of Omega Psi Phi. They were using one of their father's warehouses to conduct these pledging rituals that were outside of the official membership intake process. And they were beating the boys in their chest with boxing gloves on. I cannot stress how significant this case is and how disappointed I am in the follow-up to his case, because so often in the D9 realm, the fraternities and sororities are often able to wiggle their way out of accountability because the death is happening while the person is participating in some other activity, and oftentimes they're getting a lawsuit years down the road, where a parent wants to attribute the fatigue or whatever state of mind that person or physicality that person was in to a process that they can't clearly define because it didn't happen during the process. It is an accusation, not a clearly defined thing that, other people are willing to state they witnessed. In Caleb's case, he precisely died during the pledging process. Again, I can't stress, this was not a part of the official intake process. And to have such a clear-cut example where the organization of Omega Psi Phi cannot walk away from it. And not only is the question about what accountability has actually been held in this matter, but how did we even get here in 2025, where such a ridiculous act of violence is being done to young men, and it has so many different hands up the pipeline of that organization, allowing such an event to occur from administration at Southern University, from past members, from the chapter, from older men who should have had some sense, some wits. So much accountability should have been handled and never happened. So what got us here and what is happening in the aftermath? We actually don't have a lot of cases where people are passing away during intake processes. It's not even a consistent occurrence within the organizations at large, especially the sororities. Of the D9 organizations, the sororities largely do not have this consistent pattern of violence happening that leads to notable harm in such a way, because they tend to be much more strict and much more quick about adding policy addendums to become more strict about their intake process. But in the wake of Caleb's death, many were left to tussle with this idea of how do we finally really put a nail in the coffin to hazing? How do we get rid of hazing culture that has been so persistent, especially now that we are confronted with such a blatant example of death happening within a pledging process? And largely, my hypothesis is that we are never truly going to be able to get rid of hazing culture, because hazing is embedded into American culture. If we look at American culture at large and we go back to that policy definition about reasonable risk, so much of American culture informs us that we are supposed to put ourselves in the line of direct exploitation, exhaustion, being worn down in order to ascend the ladder of success. We have a plethora of presidents who have been fraternity members and in Ivy League social clubs like Skull and Bones and the Porcelain Club. We have William H. Taft and both George Bushes, George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, who were in Skull and Bones at Yale. Bill Clinton was in the Order of De Molloy, a youth group affiliated with the Freemasons. 14 presidents have been Freemasons, and a bevy of them were in the Independent Order of Oddfellows. All organizations that have laborious intake processes themselves. And a lot of times these intake processes are meant to cement exclusion and elitism amongst their members. Then we get to the fact that, well, we do obviously, because I can't do a video without talking about capitalism, but yeah, babes. Capitalism and the exploitation of labor means it is super easy for people to find themselves in a situation where they can very easily define, but don't have much legality to claim that they are exceeding the reasonable risk that can be expected by taking on particular jobs. It's super easy to find yourself being hazed, not only at college, but school in general, K through 12, at your church, at your workplace, any organization, club, crew, clique. Hazing can easily be replicated in any sort of group setting. Anywhere where there is a power structure, where there is a club of people that are seen as above other people, and you have aspirations to ascend into that particular elite membership, it is super easy for hazing to appear because of the way that American culture already functions. Everyone's definition of above reasonable risk is going to be different. Law firms absolutely have a practice of hazing their new employees. That when you start a new law firm, it is expected for you to do long, overnight, over weekends, over holiday hours in order to ascend towards partner status at a law firm. And these are career paths that are highly esteemed in America, but investment banking is nothing but hazing. But when a good paying check is involved, all should be forgiven, because wealth is the standard, not the practice of care for human beings in America. Clearly, especially under this current administration. What's a med school residency? Have you ever inquired what those hours and what that time commitment looks like, and how much students in their medical residency right before they become doctors are actually getting paid? It's all a haze. People are being asked to exhaust their bodies to work hours that are non-sustainable for the actual physical human body. And yet this is standard practice that is accepted amongst powerful institutions. Lawyers, investment bankers, and doctors all go through these long, arduous hazing processes, and they are seen as the cream of crop of society. And if their pathway to reaching success is essentially a hazing process, what stops people from believing that they should just, even the term get it out the mud, that you have to suffer in order to attain? That is innately an American train of thought. And it makes hazing such an easy thing for people to fall into. Hazing is absolutely a cyclical process because we live in a society that often pushes people towards these exploitative processes. I just named 3 career paths that are highly esteemed, and we are framing these hazing processes as ascending social ladders that allow you access to elite spaces. Once membership is achieved, the hazing feels worthwhile and then becomes the expectation of everyone who follows after you. The formerly hazed then feel very empowered to enact the same violence that they once turned their nose up at onto others. Even if you don't feel empowered to do so, the pathways to speak out and impact change, you're gonna get a whole lot of pushback. You might even ostracize yourself in the process. And it's really unfortunate that oftentimes in American society, we get a lot further by enacting the same exploitation and harm that happened to us, enacting it onto others in order to get our lick back, essentially, but also allowing us to keep people down while we enjoy being up. There are so many other examples. I'm sure as you're watching this video, comment in other spaces where you've experienced this sort of things that you could easily define as beyond the reasonable risk that should be incurred, and therefore it is hazing. And how many times have I even said as a graduate student, I already pledged, I ain't being hazed again. There are so many times in this graduate school journey where I have said, y'all are not finna haze me. And why I'm even being confronted with treatment that feels like being hazed at a place of higher education by my own professors. It's crazy how people can obscure the hazing that they are participating in and putting on others by saying, I require these things because I want to make sure you are XYZ. But when you try to bring it to the attention of the higher ups that have the power to negate the amount of hazing you're experiencing, they tell you it's just par for the course. You need to toughen up because grad school wasn't made for everybody to get through. And this is why hazing is embedded into American culture, because there's plenty of other spaces where you will hear a similar refrain about this space wasn't meant for everyone and you need to prove yourself by making a commitment to something that is exhausting to your physical being. Let's get a little bit more specific to the D9 here and why hazing culture will never die within the D9 unless we get rid of the cultural cachet that comes from people's perceptions of pledging. There is a social currency that comes from people thinking, perceiving, knowing, having an idea that you pledged. There's a cultural cachet that comes from the perception of pledging. Everybody has a different definition of what it means to be made. This is a very common term amongst D9 members. Were you made right? Were you made good? Because there is an intake process. And even as the sororities at least become much more stricter and what that intake process can entail and anything out of it, they are quick to put the hammer down on. There's still a lot of talk about being made right. You ever end up in a lemon squeeze, you ever end up in a sisterhood chat about what's going on with your chapter, and you will absolutely hear somebody say, nobody's been made right since 2002. Well, why, yes. In 2002, 2 pledgees that were Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority in Long Beach, California, drowned during a pledging ritual. And all the sororities changed their intake process right after those 2 cases made the news. So what do you mean nobody's been made right since 2002? Like, quite literally, people will get in. You'll hear this at a chapter meeting, on a chapter call, during official business. There's so many inappropriate times where you will hear the refrain, well, nobody's been made right, insert year. And you could absolutely look up the news from that year and find a very dire news story about somebody passing away while trying to enter into a D9 organization. And that's why the organizations all redid their intake process and made it even more restrictive. Yeah, so you don't get rid of hazing culture when those refrains are still very prevalently heard by older members of the organization. And that creates a climate and a culture where people want to pledge because they want to be made properly. I think from my own personal lens here, why I would lean towards the thought of pledging being desirable, and I understand the desirableness of pledging. The sororities are extraordinarily restrictive with their official membership intake process. And I'll get into this later in the video, but we're really at a juncture, especially for the sororities, where they're trying to policy away exhaustion because some of the more notable cases of hazing from the D9 sororities often often has people that are tired, they're falling asleep behind the wheel, they're falling asleep leads to physical harm. But in attempting to policy away exhaustion, they are restricting the sort of information that you are allowed to learn during intake process, meaning you could only learn national information. You are not allowed to learn any information about your chapter. You should not be required to learn about any of the members that preceded you in this chapter. And you can get in a lot of trouble if it's found out that you are doing that while doing the intake process. For some of the funnest memories I have of doing membership intake, we're staying up late at night learning information about my line sisters and about my big sisters, my prophytes, the chapter members. You know, my line name is Her Story. It's a very corny line name, but it's because I like history and I know so many people. And I did like collecting information on people. It was fun and it proved to be extraordinarily beneficial. You have to get to know members of your chapter. Ushering in new members of an organization is actually a big financial burden. It's natural that when your prophytes, especially your older prophytes, are expected to take you out to lunch, expected to help you participate, because D9 organizations are also very expensive, and expected to help mitigate the cost of maintaining active membership while you're in college, that they want something that endears you to them. And there is an expectation that we have something pulling us together, whether it's dollars, it's my time, you know, we're asking for some sort of a commitment to a person, and it behooves you to have something that will endear people to you. And if you have already learned information about people and you have a genuine interest in who they are, and not just you, my prophyte, can you pay for lunch, you'll get a lot further. It helps with networking, but it is entirely illegal now. You know, I understand both sides of the coin in this manner of trying to policy away people taking on too much work and exhausting themselves in the process. But also there is a social currency that comes from having specific experiences and a camaraderie, at least amongst your line, and even more so amongst your chapter. People want to pledge in part because they desire a sense of belonging. And a lot of people enjoy the elitism that the D9 produces. I have gotten on the internet and talked about how the D9 is elitist, and people will beat you back over that because they like that. They enjoy the elitism and they enjoy belonging to what they perceive as elite. Even more so, HBCU culture is rife with the talented 10th ideology. Even though W.E.B. Du Bois, who is the one that initially came up with this talented 10th idea that 10% of the Black community should ascend to success, whether they go to college and they become doctors and lawyers and professional people, and then that will trickle down through the rest of the Black community, that if we can have this upper middle class that ascends and succeeds and we maintain that upper middle class, the influence from them will trickle down. You know, 100 years out, we know that don't really work. For some reason, when I first stepped on the yard at Howard University in 2003, there was a Talented 10th Club, and it kind of motivated this idea that everyone should have a pledge process to prove one's worthiness, and it creates a sense of belonging for every organization. Members on all the organizations talk out of both sides of their mouth. I, before producing this video, watched a few documentaries. There's one on PBS that is produced by a member of Omega Psi Phi, and he's talking to his own line brothers. He's talking about his own experience being hazed, and how right after that he was gonna like push for no hazing, and he called it Big Brother Love, and then he talks to the person he hazed, and they both laugh about it, like in a very violent engagement that they had with each other, and they laugh about it. And then the bros, which is a colloquial term for members of Omega Psi Phi, but the bros are at the end kind of all shrugging it off, like, you know, just par for the course. It happened, you know? In sororities, it's just as bad. You know, people are talking out of both sides of their mouth. They are talking about, oh, no lines were made right since whatever. And people will be very quick to say that, you know, you're lacking, or what they believe to be you're lacking in character comes from you not being made right. Well, what do you mean by not being made right? Because I did the official intake process. What could have gone wrong, soror? Because I do believe that hazing culture, especially at this juncture, is not going to die, largely because of the social currency that pledging still has within every organization. I myself have never participated in bringing members into the organization. I have never participated in membership intake at undergraduate or while in a graduate alumni chapter. I'm not gonna do it. Unfortunately, I do understand why people want to pledge. I understand the social currency. I understand the camaraderie. I understand the value in having a closeness to at least your line sisters and the pro-fights who are participating in your intake process. I understand the value of having a camaraderie that's built on a specific experience that only you and this clique had. And I understand the knowledge that you want to procure and the fun you can have. I mean, I had a lot of fun. Would I do it again? Absolutely not. And I don't want to lose my letters, so I will never participate in membership intake myself. Zero desire to ever do that. I offhanded mentioned an incident that happened in 2002 with the AKAs. And then there wasn't another notable incident of death until 2010 at East Carolina University. 4 young women who were pledging Delta Sigma Theta were in a car on the way to a hairdresser's appointment for their new initiate presentation, something formerly known as a probate, but probate highlights pledging. And since these organizations no longer pledge, it is a new initiate presentation. And they were going to get their hair done, and the driver fell asleep behind the wheel, killing the 2 ladies in the backseat of the car. Victoria Carver, 20 years old, and Brianna Gather, also 20 years old. The driver, Camille Arrington, was convicted of a misdemeanor death by motor vehicle, and the chapter members and advisors were expelled from the sorority in 2015. But this does lead me to asking, can you policy away the possibility and impact of exhaustion while going through intake? Even if organizations and chapters are sticking just to the very limited official process, how do you account for excitement? How do you account for a full-time student who is working and participating in intake and balancing, because all the organizations have a big focus on maintaining a good GPA, but balancing that with a full-time school workload, and whether it's a part-time, contractual, whatever, it's any type of job, on top of the excitement of finally doing something that at whatever juncture, whether you're doing it at 19 or 45 years old, was a lifelong dream. Because people who go through the grad chapter intake process, which tends to be much more by the book, will still tell you that any of the official processes are simply exhausting because you put so much priority on achieving this lifelong dream and the excitement that comes with making sure you do it right. The organizations, as I've noted, have already limited the required information by making it illegal to require members to learn information about previous chapter members, about chapter history at large, aside from like the basic information of like the chapter founding, essentially, right? And this is their attempt at lessening the load and making sure that from a policy standpoint, nobody is exhausted. But I don't know if that can ever truly be met. I think because of the sororities are still taking on the accountability that these fraternities should be expensing for their own hazing problem. But because this is a hazing problem that largely falls under the umbrella of, well, it's the D9 organizations, it's the NPHC, it seems that because the sororities are better organized and have more political interests, that they are the ones responding quicker and punishing their members more arduously and more hardly. So let's discuss the fraternities. I think in 2025, especially, the visibility of School Days, the 1988 Spike Lee film that makes a mockery of the pledging that were much more prevalent and much more hazing forward in the 1980s. Spike Lee himself somehow managed to go through Morehouse College without pledging anything, which was a feat in the 1980s. In School Days, the main fraternity is Gamma Phi Gamma, and then Gamma Ray sorority. It hits on the colorism that was common, the classism that was common, the elitism, and it really kind of makes a mockery of the entire pledging process that D9 organizations were knee deep in the 1980s. And somehow in 2025, the imagery and the mockery that was expressed in School Days has been embraced, highlighted in their probates, in their new initiate presentations in 2025. To see the fraternities embracing imagery from a film that was meant to highlight their own absurdity and really now is showcasing their celebration of hazing in 2025, really it's crazy work. And most notably, I'm thinking of the Omega Psi Phi chapter at Clark Atlanta and Morehouse College. Yeah, the AUC. I will say, even for the sorority side, the AUC, they be getting away with some things. all right? The fraternities embracing school days, which was meant to make a mockery of their organizations, and doing it through their probates and their new initiate presentations is absolutely outlandish. Even before we get to the 2025 and the death of Caleb Wilson, I believe, was this 2024? Last year, I called one of my friends who is a member of Omega Psi Phi after Clark Atlanta's probate. These boys came out with their numbers shaved into their heads. A direct homage of school days. I remember calling my homeboy and be like, them boys look like they stink. I know they pledged. And if you look in the background, it's all these older members. Beaming, smiling, radiating joy. These are men of esteem, men with status in the organization, smiling gleefully at these displays in celebration of hazing. And you'll see this across the fraternities where they are more likely, you're not shaving women's heads, but the men will come out with their head shaved. They'll come out in torn up clothing. They'll come out in uniform clothing that suggests that they went through a very arduous process. And there will be older members in the audience beaming with joy at this display in celebration of hazing. There are certain ordained chapters, even for the sororities, that are allowed to get away with more displays of celebration of what is, by the own national organization's definition of hazing, is hazing. Where other chapters will get snatched up for it, there are sanctioned chapters. A lot of them are at the AUC that get away with celebrating, pledging within their probate presentations. One way that I think members also talk out of both sides of their mouths is that each organization has imagery and assets and cultural markers that are significant to the organization that also signify hazing. But we have not gotten rid of those cultural markers in full, even though they're outlawed or illegal to show up during the intake process. They still are very visible after crossing. In particular, for the deltas, there were the ducks. Ducks are absolutely an illegal process for intake. I can't even say too much more. But you will absolutely see people get jackets with ducks on the back of them. Especially you giving somebody from a grad chapter a duck denim jacket. Oh, okay. Oftentimes when you read articles about people getting taken down, there's a lot of references to duck ponds and duck lakes and duck houses and all that stuff being deeply illegal in the organization and means for suspension, or whether chapter, whether members, whatever. But the visibility will lead a lot of people to believing that they should want to have proximity to a cultural marker that is highly valued within the organization. And this is replicated in each of the sororities, where they'll have cultural markers that often come from the different nomenclature that comes from this association with unofficial mascots of the organization, and the national organization attempting to policy away, saying that you cannot have any part of your intake process include these cultural markers. But these cultural markers are often given as gifts. They're used to signify members that are made correctly. If we give value to these cultural markers, we can't expect people to not want to have proximity to the significance of what those cultural markers belie. And if these organizations ordain that as hazing, well then the desire for pledging is really thrown in a lot of people's faces. If you have any access to the organization, I remember doing Jabberwock, which is a debutante program done by Delta Sigma Theta, and you get a mentor who is a member from the chapter. And I distinctly remember that she had just come in through Wilmington alumni. I was in Delaware. I just was astounded that her as a doctor was being talked down to so badly by her pro-fights within the chapter. And I made a commitment to myself that I will never come through grad chapter, because I'm never going to let somebody talk to me like that when I'm established. The fuck? You know, that was 2002. I would have hoped that 20 something years later, the organizations that have made such a big commitment to being non-hazing organizations would address the way that these cultural markers and cultural significance of pledging is so highly addressed and so highly spoken of amongst members. And I don't believe it's actually been addressed properly. The policy focus is not addressing the cultural cachet that comes through the discursive nature of these organizations. And I think that will have to be addressed if they really want to curtail the remaining functions of hazing. And an issue that definitely pops up in the fraternities, and I addressed this somewhat in my video on why Black men don't go to college, a video you should absolutely watch. Please go watch that. it's in depth, girl. That was actually a video where I talked about the institutional powers that intersect in young Black boys' lives and don't really make the pathway towards college successful or optional. And one of those is our comfort with hemming up young boys. And I think because that is something that is replicated by members of society, that's not something that just Black men do to Black boys. It is something that we collectively, we, they, them, she, her, he, her, him, all do young Black boys. This idea that they need to be hemmed up and manhandled and strong-armed in order to get them to act the right way carries through into college and the way they are engaged with by professors, and then they engage with each other during membership intake. This expectation that to be a man or to be masculine or to be a boy means that you should just be used to more roughhousing. Where does roughhousing land us on the reasonable risk of pursuing membership to any organization? Men are socialized to believe that things should just be harder for them. The other issue that compounds the hemming up that we are already socially comfortable with, particularly when it comes to Black boys and Black men, then also is compounded by militarization of fraternities. Now, I do know that there's a historical reasoning for the fraternities taking on a more militarized intake process, particularly in the 1970s and 80s when we get the VA Act that was passed under Lyndon Johnson in the late 1960s, and going into the military becomes a pathway for entering into college. And you have more Black men who come from the military entering into the college. And I'm focusing on Omega Psi Phi here because I think they have the most outlandish, visible presentation of celebrating hazing culture than having a death occur specifically during intake at the beginning of this year at a highly lauded chapter in the organization. And they also are visibly the most aligned with sort of like the Marines, the Army fatigues, the gold combat boots, these cultural markers that are significant to their fraternity when the fraternity was founded by a bunch of nerds at Howard University. And that's not a bad thing. Actually, was it not Drew Hall? Maybe it was Drew Hall, maybe it wasn't. I'm not expected to know the history of the fraternities. I'm in a sorority. But y'all had scientists. Langston Hughes was an early member of Omega Psi Phi. Y'all had witty, poetic Negroes in your organization, cultural movers and shakers, people that were inventing, our ability to do blood drives and donate blood, like people that were making significant pathways in the cultural makeup of the United States and in science. And somehow that organization that had so many thinkers and thought leaders early on in their founding has now been like, I'm the party boy that eats coochie. I could stick my tongue out real long and look at me in my fatigues. I throw a good party. You want some oil? I have some very close friends who are men of Omega. These are people who I would not die for, but I will ride for. And I know there is another side to the fraternity where some of the older members do a lot for the community. I mean, their theme is friendship is essential to the soul. And I had a friend who suddenly passed away in a very tragic incident who was a member of Omega Psi Phi. Going to that funeral was a very life-changing, illuminating point in my 20s. But that Omega man image and that Omega man presentation still comes after the very visible fatigue, whoredom, have some oil, good party stage. And that stage is much more visible than the Omega Man stage. And I do think that organization in particular has some work to do with the way that they have embraced militarization of their fraternity, and it has absolutely shown up in the violence and harm, because joining the military is one big haze. It's okayed by the state, and the military and the army has their own problems. It's rampant with sexual assault. There is no pathway for accountability or remediations. You are expected to just suck it up and deal with it, but why would we want to copy the imperialistic, exploitative nature, the violent nature of the military in a Black organization? It's time to change course, because the fraternities, and again, especially Omega Psi Phi, has an issue with being a pipeline to police officers, to federal agents, to security, and baby, I definitely have questions about some of these Black ICE agents we're seeing, because I already know some of them have fraternity affiliations. Absolutely, would be entirely unsurprised. Even if we look at the death of Tyree Nichols in Memphis, Tennessee, who was killed by 5 black police officers who beat Nichols to death after pulling him over for a traffic stop. 3 of those members were in Omega Psi Phi, and all of them have since had their membership revoked. My biggest critique in doing this video is that the organizations overall don't have a liberatory politic towards black people. They do reaffirm a lot of elitism, a lot of surveillance, and even as they push to be non-hazing organization, they find other ways to haze. I think in the wake of Caleb Wilson, what's most damning to me is that in 2019, when Brandon Adams, who's 21 years old and was at step practice as a pledgee for Omega Psi Phi, when he passed away and collapsed during step practice, the organization put a moratorium on intake. Somehow that moratorium led to, the AUC having a probate and them like mirroring school days to the letter. The Caleb Wilson death, which I think is much more exact to the problems that they have within the organization and within their intake. And they just have cultural markers like taking it to the green. There's a whole lot that someone from the outside can see and can hear as a non-member about how they engage with people who don't pledge or who aren't made right. And I haven't seen much publicly addressed by the organization. And maybe now that I'm 40 years old, I'm a mom, my focuses are very different. I've called and asked my homeboys what's going on, and it's been a lot of shrugs, but I'm surprised that there hasn't been a more exact action taken by the national body of that organization to show the accountability they are taking for the death of Caleb Wilson. The fraternities stay having cases where people are being sent to the hospital, and that's the other side of it. In a sorority, if you get suspended or expelled, you are exiled largely from the organization. Fraternities, you can get expelled. You still finna hop at your wedding. You gonna have your frat will still show up at your wedding. Y'all can all hop and they'll do the sing and they'll do the sweetheart song with you and act like nothing ever happened. And largely, if you look at these PBS specials, there was one called Hazing, which looked at the Kappa Alpha Psi and this young man who talked about being paddled and putting him in the hospital. His mother actually called it in, and his mother was an AKA. Like, his mother and father were both in D9 organizations, and they're like, you're in the hospital because you got paddled. Paddling is crazy to me. Asking somebody to bend over and take wood is absolutely an insane practice. And I don't know why, even if I do understand why people want to pledge, why are we doing anything that we would not do in the main square in the daytime is happening within anybody's pledge process. Like, why are we even doing that? But he was paddled so severely that he ended up in the hospital. And when it was called out to the national organization's attention, he was excommunicated. He was cut off. He was made out to be unaccepted by his own frat. Because at this point, he had crossed. It's crazy. There's a clip of Mark Lamont Hill in this documentary. He's a Kappa. And after watching a video of Kappas being paddled and physically beaten on the chest, he says,
what I would say is that people should go through something.
This thought of, particularly for men, having to go through something physical and oftentimes aligning with physical violence, needing to go through that is such a pervasive train of thought. We really do believe that black boys should be hemmed up, that hands need to be put on them in order for them to come out better people. And it aligns with the concept of what does it even mean to be masculine in America? And for black men, why does their proof of masculinity have to engage with a certain sort of violence that is not expected of white men? I will never understand, and I have had this conversation with various members of organizations about how I just don't understand the concepts of paddling, and people will really defend it. Definitely. So where do we go from here? All the organizations need to have robust policy that addresses what is the official intake process and what is not allowed. They need to have policy that explicitly states what is not allowed in intake processes. You can't strip camaraderie completely from the intake process, because if that's done, people are going to seek that camaraderie outside of the process, and that is when you get into hazing. But I think overall, as members of these organizations, if we want to see this violence, at least, even if pledging is okay, if you want to see the violence eradicated from the intake process, you need to change the way you talk about members. You need to change the way you talk about younger members, about newer initiates into your organization. You need to let go of the cultural markers that are aligned with these intake processes that are now illegal within your organization. You can't walk around with cultural markers and signifiers that showcase a process that people do not and should not have access to in 2025. And because you crossed in 1970, 1960, whatever, you feel dignified to prove how you are exceptional to other members of the organization when your exception comes through the death or harm that somebody else endured, that was brought to light, and then intake was changed. That elitism that you feel that is aligned with these cultural markers and signifiers of hazing comes on the back of harm done to somebody who was brave enough to call out the organization. These new members are not getting the easy pathway or skating or inferior because of their own cognition and their own desires. The organization that you have fidelity and allegiance to made that decision as a executive body, and new members are following those policies. They should not be blamed. They should not be deterred. They should not be demeaned because they don't have access to the hazing culture that you were brought in under. And you shouldn't be discursively replicating that hazing. You shouldn't be celebrating it. All right, we gotta let it go. And the organizations absolutely have to apply their policy universally. There should not be chapters that get away visibly, especially with more than other chapters, because you breed people doing even worse in the dark, right? When people have to pursue things for access and circumvent other policies to prove themselves, things are gonna go off the rails even quicker. We have to end this certain chapters having special privileges that allow them to get away with more. That chapter needs to be able to do those things because they've done it so well, or it brings positive marketing and imagery back to the organization. Maybe we need to be rethinking the way policy is employed across the organization. Maybe some things have room to come back under certain standards and boundaries that need to be implemented from the top down. But let me know your thoughts. There's definitely more we could talk about here, and I hope we do. As always, subscribe if you're new here, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share with your friends. Deuces!